You know that moment when someone looks at you like you're furniture, and then it turns out you're the only one in the building who can keep the lights on? This story is exactly that. And I promise, by the time we get to the end of it, you're going to think differently about who actually knows how to fix things. Stay with me. The fortress had been dying for 300 years. Everyone in the galaxy had looked at the numbers and quietly agreed to let it. That was the thing nobody mentioned in the briefing documents. Not the age, not the history, not the 16 civilizations that had sent expert teams and gotten the same answer back. The briefing documents talked about the Valdris Citadel, the way you talk about an elderly relative whose doctor has already had the quiet conversation with the family. Careful language, respectful distance, the unspoken agreement that the dignified thing was to stop making a fuss about it. Marcus Hale read every page of those documents on the 14-hour shuttle ride to the Valdris system. By the time the Citadel came into view through the viewport, he had two thoughts. One, the briefing writers had significantly undersold how enormous it was. Two, they had significantly oversold how much anyone expected him to actually fix it. He was, after all, just a mechanic, not an engineer, not a member of any of the prestigious galactic restoration guilds whose representatives had reportedly looked at the structural diagnostics and suggested politely that perhaps some things were simply meant to end. Marcus had a toolkit that had survived 4 postings, a reputation for fixing things the manuals said were finished, and an appointment with a queen who had asked Earth specifically for someone practical. Not impressive. Practical. He was still working out whether that was a compliment. The Valdris Citadel sat at the intersection of 3 territorial boundaries. Whether that was genius planning by the original builders, or a spectacular case of picking the worst possible location and daring the universe to say something about it, Marcus couldn't tell from the shuttle. What he could tell was that for 11 centuries the place had been neutral ground, somewhere 3 civilizations that didn't trust each other enough to meet on home soil could meet on ground that was equally inconvenient for all of them. 37 major treaties signed inside those walls, 12 wars that found somewhere else to happen because this building existed. It had survived bombardment, siege, a full power failure in its 3rd century, and something the historical records called the Incident of 847, without elaborating further. Marcus had read that entry 3 times. The records never explained. He respected that. Now the building was losing a slow fight against its own age, and the Queen who held its custodianship had apparently decided that if 16 expert teams couldn't save it, maybe what it needed was someone who hadn't read enough history to know it was hopeless. The docking bay had one attendant, a tall, angular being from the Suri people, whose translator pendant gave everything a tone of polite resignation. "Ambassador Hale, welcome. Her Majesty Queen Smirked is expecting you in the primary audience chamber. I am required to inform you the lift system in the eastern wing is currently inoperative. Environmental controls in sections 7 through 12 are running at 40%, and 3 of the main corridor lighting grids have been dark for approximately 6 years. We navigate those sections from memory." Marcus wasn't really listening anymore. He was looking at the ceiling joints, at the hairline fractures running along the joins in a pattern that told him something specific about where the stress was coming from. He could smell something electrical that had been burning slowly for a long time, not acutely, just steadily, the way old wiring smells when it's been working too hard for too many years. The floor had a faint vibration under his feet that most people would ignore. He set down his toolkit and pulled out his diagnostic scanner before he'd officially checked in. The readout was not good. The attendant had seen this reaction before. The restoration guilds responded similarly, he offered. The 3rd team left their scanner behind when they departed. They said they preferred not to look at the numbers anymore. Marcus pocketed his scanner. Fair enough. Where's the Queen? The staircase up to the audience chamber was the kind of staircase that made you feel the history of a place, whether you wanted to or not. Partly by design, and partly because the stairs had been sagging long enough that the sag had become architectural. Marcus used the climb to look at things, the stress fractures in the wall stone, and what they said about which sections had been patched over the centuries and which had been left. Door frames that were slightly off true in a direction that meant the foundation had been shifting. The air that tasted different on different landings, which was either the environmental systems or a problem he was putting on the later list. Queen Smirked was at the far window when he entered, looking out over the three borders her citadel held apart. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the stillness of someone who had spent a long time learning to look calm. Her people, the Valdrani, had a natural iridescence to their skin that shifted with mood, and hers right now was moving through what his briefing materials described as the range between deep worry and managed exhaustion. She turned. Her eyes went to his toolkit, then to his face, then back to the toolkit. "So, you are Earth's contribution to the problem of my dying fortress." Marcus set the toolkit down, which was probably not the protocol-approved opening move. He'd read the section on greeting gestures. He'd found it less useful than what the staircase had already told him. "Your Eastern Foundation is compensating for a stress fracture in the primary load column," he said. "It's been growing for about 60 years. Someone patched it in 2084-70 with a bonding compound that was second-rate even then. The patch held longer than it deserved to, but it's not holding anymore. That's why your lower corridors vibrate. That's also why the East Wing lift stopped working. The shaft alignment went when the columns started flexing." Seravine stared at him. "You have been here 11 minutes. Marcus picked the toolkit back up. "I read fast. Your west wall has a different problem, and the atmospheric processors in sections 7 through 12 aren't failing from age. Something is drawing power from that grid that shouldn't be. I want to see your original construction schematics, the ones from the 1st century, not the renovation records. Those will show me what the builders actually intended before everyone started making helpful improvements." The iridescence in her skin shifted into a color his briefing materials hadn't catalogued. Her chin came up slightly. The corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile yet, but was thinking about it. "You're just a mechanic," she said. "Not quite a dismissal, not quite a test. Something in the middle, waiting." Marcus had heard some version of that sentence on 4 different worlds. The people who said it were usually the ones who'd already been told by very qualified experts that their problem was too complex to solve, and had started to confuse complexity with impossibility. He'd learned not to argue with it directly. He looked around the chamber instead, at the old stone, at the fractures, at the window where a queen stood watching 3 civilizations' worth of territorial borders that stayed mostly peaceful because this building existed. "Yeah," he said. "So let's get started." The schematics room was buried so deep in the Citadel's lower levels that Marcus genuinely wondered if the original builders had hidden it deliberately. 3 wrong turns, 1 corridor so dark he navigated by sound, and a door that required Seravine's personal authorization code just to acknowledge it existed. When it finally opened, the smell that rolled out was old paper and something else underneath, the specific mustiness of a room that had been sealed long enough that the air inside belonged to a different era. He loved it immediately. The room held construction records in formats spanning 11 centuries of archival technology, stone tablets next to crystalline data cores, next to something that looked uncomfortably biological that Marcus filed under "Do not examine until necessary." A single work table sat in the center, with an interface panel that flickered when he touched it, startled rather than broken, the way old hardware acts when it hasn't been asked to do anything in a long time. Seravine stood in the doorway watching him the way people watch someone handle something they can't replace. He'd seen that look before, on a colony station administrator whose life support had been held together by 4 mismatched components and a refusal to panic, and on a deep space relay operator who'd been alone with a failing reactor for 6 months before Marcus arrived. It was the look of someone who had hoped for a long time and learned to be very careful about it. "Pull up the Foundation layouts first," Marcus said, not looking up. "1st century, before the Northern expansion, and whatever the original builders called their primary support system, because I guarantee they named it, and I guarantee the Century 8 renovation team renamed everything, which is half of why the repair records don't match the actual structure." "You have worked on old buildings before," Seravine said. "I worked on a water processing station on Kepler 62F that was built by 3 civilizations across 400 years, Marcus said. None of them left complete records. 2 had been at war with the 3rd. The station was still running when I left. He found the Foundation layouts and expanded the holographic display until the room filled with ghostly blue lines. He stood looking at it for a moment. Whoever built this thing knew what they were doing. Look at the load distribution. The primary columns aren't just bearing weight, they're designed to flex. The whole structure was meant to move with geological shifts. That's why it survived 11 centuries. He traced one of the load paths with his finger. Someone in century 6 decided that was a flaw and tried to rigidify everything. That's when the problem started. Seravine stepped into the room properly for the first time, drawn in by something she probably hadn't meant to show. She stopped beside the display. Her iridescence shifted toward the color Marcus was starting to read as concentrated thinking. The Restoration Guild, in their final report, called the original design fundamentally compromised. They said the flexibility you are describing was evidence of poor initial engineering. Marcus looked at her, then at the blueprints. Then he held up his scanner and showed her the readout from the Eastern Foundation column, the one that had been patched in 2084, the one that was fighting the building's own design with every year that passed. The structure was trying to flex, he said, and repair after repair convinced it that was wrong, so it started breaking instead. He let that sit. The guild wasn't lying to you. They were reading the building against the only framework they knew. This one works differently. Seravine was quiet for a moment. The holographic lines moved across her face, pale blue light catching the iridescence in her skin and making it look like something between starlight and weather. Then she said, "How long were you on Kepler 62F?" 8 months. And before that? A recycling processor on the Outer Belt station. 6 months. Before that, water reclamation in the Trappist colonies. About a year. He kept tracking the original flex points through the display. Before that, a communications relay that everyone agreed was beyond saving. 5 months. You have never stayed anywhere longer than a year. He heard it as an observation, not a criticism, so he answered it plainly. No. But I've never started on a job this size either. She moved to the other side of the table. Her voice had the careful quality of someone asking something that actually matters. The Restoration Guilds each spent between 3 weeks and 4 months here. Their teams covered structural engineering, materials science, historical architecture, at least 6 different specializations across the reports, and none of them found what you found in an afternoon. None of them pulled the first-century schematics. They worked from the Century 4 renovation records, because those loaded automatically in the standard archive format. He finally looked up at her. Nobody read the original manual because it required an extra step to access. She looked at him. He couldn't read the full expression yet. Her iridescence was cycling too fast. But something in it was moving towards something he recognized. The particular shift that happens when someone realizes the problem they've been carrying was different from the one they thought it was. "What does the original manual tell you that they missed?" she asked. "That the Citadel isn't broken the way everyone thinks it's broken." He pulled up the flex point analysis and rotated the model slowly. The structure isn't collapsing under its own weight. It's been fighting for 300 years against repairs that kept trying to turn it into something it was never built to be. Strip out the rigidification work from Century 6, restore the original flex tolerances in the primary columns, and the active deterioration stops. After that, it's maintenance, not rescue. The silence that followed was the kind that takes a moment to process good news after a very long time of bracing for bad. Marcus had sat in it before. He'd learned not to fill it. Seravine's iridescence slowed, settled, landed on a color that wasn't in his briefing materials. It was the color, he thought, of someone putting down something heavy. The guild teams, she said finally, presented their conclusions in formal sessions. 47 advisors present, presentation materials, peer-reviewed studies. She paused. "You have been here less than 3 hours and you are telling me they were all working from the wrong starting point." Marcus thought about how to answer that fairly, because she deserved a fair answer. Wrong starting point isn't the same as wrong. Wrong means the information didn't exist. Wrong starting point means the information was there, and nobody looked in the right direction for it. Her chin came up slightly. "And you looked in the right direction?" "I looked in the only direction nobody else had tried yet." He shrugged. "That's usually where the answer is." The holographic citadel rotated slowly between them, blue lines tracing the shape of something old and resilient, and deeply misread for 300 years. Then Seravine said, "My head advisor will tell me you are not qualified to make these assessments, that I should wait for a 17th Guild team rather than trust a mechanic with a scanner and a room full of 11th-century-old records." Marcus started marking the primary flex points that needed restoration, saving his work. What will you tell him? Her iridescence shifted again, and this time it landed somewhere steadier, something that had made up its mind. I will tell him, she said, that the qualified experts had 300 years and the building is still dying. She moved toward the door, then stopped without turning. There is a council session tomorrow morning. 32 representatives from the 3 border territories, here to discuss whether the Citadel is worth continued investment or whether they should begin negotiating a replacement site. I would like you to present your findings. Marcus looked up. Me? You found what 16 teams missed in 3 hours. She glanced back, and there was something in her expression that was part challenge and part something else he hadn't fully catalogued yet. I think 32 political representatives might find that relevant. He looked back at the holographic model of a building that had survived 11 centuries by being designed to move with the world instead of against it. And he thought about tomorrow, with the particular feeling of someone who has just agreed to something that is definitely more complicated than it sounds. Yeah, he said. All right. The council chamber was the most impressive room in the Citadel, which probably said something about how buildings work and who gets the nicest rooms. It occupied the entire central tower, its ceiling a dome of interlocked crystal panels that caught the system's star at specific angles throughout the day, pushing light from gold to silver to deep amber as the hours moved. 32 seats curved in a tiered semicircle around a central floor, each one built for a different anatomy, each positioned at precisely the same height as every other. Marcus suspected the height negotiations alone had taken months. He stood on the central floor with his diagnostic scanner, a portable holographic projector borrowed from the schematics room, and the specific feeling of a man who had packed as professionally as his travel bag allowed and knew it wasn't quite professional enough. Seravine sat at the chamber's head position, not elevated above the others but clearly distinct from them. Her iridescence was carefully neutral, the version Marcus had started to recognize as her public face. She had introduced him in 3 sentences: Earth's technical representative, personal appointment. Present your findings, Mr. Hale. 32 representatives of 3 civilizations looked at him with the expression of people who had set aside their mourning for something they'd already decided was a formality. He pulled up the holographic model and started talking. The original builders designed this structure to flex, he said, rotating the model so the stress distribution read clearly from every seat in the chamber. Not because they couldn't do better, because they understood something about this specific geological location that every subsequent renovation team missed. He pulled up the comparative overlay, original design against current state, and let the difference sit there for a moment before explaining it. The deterioration you're seeing isn't age. It's 300 years of the building fighting repairs that were working against its own design. A representative from the Tereshi delegation, a compact being with 4 sets of arms she was using simultaneously to take notes, eat something, and express skepticism through physical positioning, leaned forward. The Valdris Restoration Guild submitted a comprehensive report 18 months ago, concluding the structural compromise was irreversible. You're contradicting 43 specialists. I'm contradicting their starting point, Marcus said. Their report was based on Century 4 renovation records. The original schematics tell a different story. And you accessed these original schematics when, exactly? Yesterday afternoon. The silence after that was the kind produced by 32 people deciding at the same time whether to be impressed or offended. Marcus had learned the best thing to do in that silence was continue. So he did. He walked them through it without performance polish. He didn't have presentation materials or citations ready to project. What he had was the plain logic of someone who had spent years explaining broken things to people who needed to understand them well enough to trust the repair. The flex point system, the Century 6 rigidification work and what it had cost the building over 300 years, the secondary power drain in the western atmospheric grid that traced back through the original schematics to a Century 9 edition wired into the wrong circuit, drawing excess power quietly for 200 years while everyone wondered why the atmospheric systems kept failing. The eastern foundation column, the patch that had been fighting the building's own movement for 60 years. He showed them the numbers. He showed them the comparison between what the guild teams had diagnosed and what the original blueprints actually described. He laid out a repair sequence, not theoretical, using components available through existing supply chains at standard shipping timelines. When he finished, the chamber was quiet in a way that was different from before. The Tereshi representative had stopped eating. 4 sets of arms, still. "That is a significant claim," she said. "You're saying the Citadel is repairable. I'm saying it was never as broken as everyone thought. There's a difference." Seravine spoke from the head of the chamber, her voice carrying that same careful quality from the schematics room, doing something deliberate with its own neutrality. "The estimated timeline for the repair sequence, Mr. Hale. 18 months for the critical structural work, another 6 for secondary systems, the atmospheric grid, the lift realignment, the lighting circuits." Marcus paused. "Though the lighting circuits are more embarrassing than critical. Someone in Century 11 just didn't finish the job. Those could be fixed in a week." Something moved through the chamber that wasn't quite laughter, but was its diplomatic cousin. Then a representative Marcus hadn't heard from yet spoke from the upper tier. A tall, pale being from the Valdrani Border Council, whose translator gave everything an unhurried, measured quality. "I sat in this chamber 4 years ago when the first guild team presented their findings. I sat here again 2 years ago for the third team. I have listened to experts explain in increasingly sophisticated language why this building cannot be saved." His pause was deliberate. "I would like to understand why you believe you can succeed where they did not." "Not technically. I read the technical explanation. I mean the other reason." Marcus thought about it because it was a real question. "Because I don't have a reputation to protect," he said. "The guild teams came in with methodologies and institutional credibility. If their framework said the building was broken in a specific way, the repair had to match that framework. Pulling up schematics that contradicted the initial assessment would mean the assessment was wrong, and that's hard to do when 43 people have signed their names to it." He shrugged. "I came in with a scanner and no framework. The original schematics were just in the only direction I hadn't looked yet." The Valdrani representative sat with that for a moment, his iridescence shifting through colors Marcus didn't have names for. "And you believe the Citadel is worth saving? Not as a technical assessment, as a position." Marcus looked up at the crystal dome, at the light coming through it, at the history in this room. 37 treaty signatures and 12 wars that hadn't happened because this building existed and gave everyone somewhere neutral to go. "Yeah," he said, "I do." The session broke for deliberation. Marcus stood on the central floor, while 32 representatives moved into smaller clusters, and Seravine crossed the chamber toward him, with her public face doing something more complicated than it had been an hour ago. "Your presentation style," she said, stopping beside him, "is unconventional. I didn't have time to make slides." The corner of her mouth moved. "You told the Seravani delegation their previous investment was good money after a misdiagnosed problem, which is different from good money after bad. They looked like they were building to using sunk cost as a reason not to try again." Marcus glanced toward the Seravani cluster, which was in animated discussion. "I've seen that argument kill repairable things before." Seravine was quiet a moment, her iridescence cycling through something he was getting better at reading. It was the color she went when thinking about something adjacent to what she was saying. "You present yourself as simply practical," she said. "A man who traces circuits and fixes things because they need fixing." Marcus looked at her. "That's what I am, perhaps." She glanced toward the dome where the light had shifted from gold toward silver. "Or perhaps you are also someone who understands that some things are worth fighting for, even when the qualified experts have concluded otherwise, and you prefer to express that through junction diagnostics rather than speeches." Marcus didn't have an immediate answer for that, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. Before he could find one, the Tereshi representative crossed the floor toward them, 4 arms in a configuration his briefing materials listed as formal positive intent. "Mr. Hale, my delegation has questions about the Century 6 rigidification work, specifically the eastern load junctions. Could you walk us through the removal sequence?" He picked up his scanner. "Yeah," he said. "Let's start in the basement." 4 other representatives followed without being invited. Seravine watched them go. Her iridescence settled into the color he'd seen only once before, in the schematics room, when she'd understood that the building wasn't broken the way everyone had been saying it was broken. It was the color of something that had been bracing for a long time, carefully, beginning to let go. The first week of actual repair work was educational in ways the briefing documents hadn't covered. The Citadel's basement levels contained roughly 4 centuries worth of equipment that previous restoration teams had left behind when they departed, which turned out to be sometimes useful and sometimes just in the way, and occasionally both at once depending on what Marcus needed at that particular hour. Seravine's head advisor submitted his first formal written objection on day 2, which Marcus read carefully and filed. And the Citadel itself had opinions about the repair schedule that it expressed through its own particular stubbornness, the kind that comes from a building that has outlasted every attempt to change it and has developed confidence about that. Marcus started with the Eastern Foundation column because it was the thing most likely to become a crisis if he didn't, and because he had a long-standing habit of beginning with whatever scared him most and working outward. The repair meant removing 60 years of second-rate bonding compound from a load-bearing surface while the load was still on it. It required patience and sections, and it required 2 Valdrani maintenance workers who had been keeping this building functional through sheer familiarity and weren't about to let a stranger work on their building alone until they understood what he was doing. Their names were Dessa and Korath. Dessa had been maintaining the Citadel systems for 22 years. Korath had inherited the posting from his mother, who had inherited it from her father, which made him third-generation Citadel staff going back far enough that his family had been here before the first guild team ever showed up with their reports and their conclusions. They both had opinions about the bonding compound, and those opinions were not flattering. Whoever applied this had never worked a flex point structure before, Dessa said, watching Marcus take out another section from the column's eastern face. You can see where they forced it into the movement gaps. They thought the gaps were damage. They were working from an assessment that said the gaps were damage, Marcus said. Classic case of the diagnosis creating the problem. Once the report classified the gaps as structural failure, every team that came after patched them. The building kept trying to flex, the patches cracked. The cracks looked like more failure. The next team patched those too. Korath made the sound of someone who has watched a preventable thing happen for a very long time. 60 years of fixing the wrong thing. Confidently, Marcus said, always confidently. He checked the stress readings on the column. Better. 2 more sections and the load distribution would start correcting itself. He looked at Korath. Your family has been maintaining this building for how long? My grandfather started here 81 years ago. Korath ran his hand along the column with the ease of someone touching something they've known their whole life. He always said the building moved in ways the official reports didn't account for. He documented it, submitted his observations to the 2nd and 3rd guild teams. Marcus stopped working. What did they say? That he was observing normal deterioration patterns, that his documentation, while thorough, reflected a maintenance worker's perspective rather than a structural engineering perspective. Korath said it flatly. They were polite about it. There was a particular quality to that flatness, the kind that comes after the hurt is finished and what's left behind is just the fact of it. Marcus had heard it before, from people whose knowledge hadn't come with the right credentials attached. He looked at Korath for a moment, then he made a decision. Your grandfather's documentation, do you still have it? 3 days later, Marcus added 81 years of Korath's family records to the schematics room. 3 generations of careful observation by people who knew the building better than anyone who had ever arrived with a formal assessment. Cross-referenced against the original blueprints, the gaps that neither source could fill alone disappeared. The building's movement patterns across 8 decades of first-hand observation matched almost perfectly with what the original builders had designed. Almost. With 3 specific deviations that told Marcus exactly where the Century 6 rigidification work had permanently changed the flex dynamics and what the repair sequence needed to account for. He brought the updated analysis to Seravine on a Thursday evening. She was in the East Tower Library, reading something in physical book format, and she set it aside without marking her place in a way that meant either her memory was excellent or the book was one she'd read before. He walked her through everything. The adjusted repair sequence, the revised timeline, which had shortened by 3 months because Korath's documentation had eliminated 2 months of diagnostic work Marcus had been planning to do from scratch. When he finished, Seravine was quiet in the way that meant she was thinking about something beyond the technical part. My head advisor submitted a formal objection this morning, she said, to the council's provisional approval of your repair plan. He cited your lack of guild certification, the absence of peer review for your structural assessment, and what he described as an over-reliance on anecdotal maintenance records of questionable analytical rigor. Marcus thought about Korath's grandfather writing down everything he observed for 27 years, submitting it twice, being thanked politely and ignored both times. Anecdotal, he said. Seravine's iridescence shifted. He is not wrong that your methodology is unconventional. He's not wrong, Marcus agreed. He's using the same framework as the guild teams, where the validity of information is determined by the credentials of whoever collected it. He paused. Korath's grandfather spent 27 years watching this building move and wrote down what he saw. That's not anecdotal. That's a primary source. I know that, Seravine said, and her voice had a quiet precision to it. I also know that the provisional approval stands, and his objection is noted in the record. She met his eyes. I am telling you about it because you should understand the weight you are working against, not because I think he is right. Marcus nodded. He'd learned on previous jobs that the repair work and the politics of the repair work were different problems, and pretending they weren't related was how good work got stopped. How much of the council is genuinely convinced versus waiting to see if something goes wrong? Seravine considered this carefully. 12 delegations are convinced. 8 are conditionally supportive pending visible progress on the eastern column. The remaining 12 are in the position of not wanting to be the ones who blocked the attempt if it works, and not wanting to be associated with failure if it doesn't. So 11 are actually opposed, and 12 are covering their position. She tilted her head slightly. You understand political mathematics. I understand that the best argument I can make to the conditional 8 is finishing the eastern column ahead of schedule, Marcus said, which is possible if Dessa agrees to extend her hours for the next 2 weeks, and the component shipment from the Tereshi depot arrives when they said it would. He paused. Assuming the Northwest Junction doesn't have any surprises. What kind of surprises are you expecting in the Northwest Junction? The honest answer was that an anomalous power reading down there 2 days ago hadn't been fully traced yet, and anomalous power readings in Century 11 wiring in a building with known circuit problems required attention before they became emergencies. But every old building he'd worked on had a version of the Northwest Junction, some hidden thing the official records hadn't captured. Sometimes it was a problem, occasionally it was something else entirely. He told her the honest version. Seravine absorbed it without visible alarm. Would you like additional maintenance staff available? Just someone who knows where the manual power cutoffs are for that section, in case. She nodded, made a note, then looked back at him with that expression he'd been cataloguing since the audience chamber. The one that had been moving from pure assessment towards something else for weeks now, and hadn't finished deciding where it was going. You said every old building has a version of this. Every one I've worked on. How many buildings have you worked on, Mr. Hale? Marcus thought about it. Enough that I stopped being surprised by surprises. He paused. Not enough that I stopped finding them interesting. The Northwest Junction, 3 days later, had a surprise of the second kind. Behind a maintenance panel that hadn't been opened since Century 9, sealed so thoroughly by accumulated time that Korath needed 20 minutes and a specialty tool just to get it moving, Marcus found a section of the original first-century power grid that had never been touched by any subsequent renovation, completely intact. Running on a power cell technology that had been classified as obsolete for 600 years and was, according to the readings Marcus was carefully taking, still functioning at 63% of original capacity. He sat back on his heels in the narrow basement corridor and looked at it. Then he called Dessa over. She looked at the readings, then at Marcus, then at the readings again. This has been running for 1100 years, 63% capacity after 11 centuries. Marcus moved the scanner slowly across the cell array. The original builders didn't just design a flexible structure, they built redundant power systems into the foundation and sealed them behind maintenance panels so they wouldn't be modified by people who didn't understand what they were looking at. Dessa said something that translated roughly as the most profound professional disbelief Marcus had heard in several years. They were protecting the building from future repairs. Marcus thought about that. About builders 11 centuries ago, who understood their work well enough to know the greatest long-term threat to what they'd made wasn't time or siege or power failure. It was well-meaning people with incomplete understanding making confident modifications. "Yeah," he said quietly. They were. He documented everything, photographed the full cell array, and spent the evening cross-referencing the find against the original blueprints until he located 4 more sealed panels in different sections of the foundation, each marked in the 1st century records with a symbol he now understood meant "Preserved Original System, Do Not Modify," which every subsequent team had read as architectural decoration. He brought it to Seravine the next morning with the feeling of someone carrying news that is going to reshape several conversations. She listened without interrupting. Her iridescence moved through surprise, then something focused and intense, then settled into a color he hadn't seen from her before. "The guild teams," she said in their final report, stated that the Citadel's power infrastructure was beyond remediation and would require complete replacement at a cost that exceeded the structure's assessed value. That conclusion was a primary factor in the Council's near decision to abandon the site. Marcus looked at her. The power infrastructure the guild teams assessed was the modified Century 9 system. The original infrastructure is intact, sealed, and has been running continuously for 1100 years without a single recorded failure. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when something very large shifts quietly, and everyone in the room is trying to measure how large. Seravine stood, moved to the window, and looked out over the 3 territorial borders her citadel had held for 11 centuries. Her iridescence was doing something he didn't have a name for, something she probably didn't show in public very often. When she turned back, her voice was steady. "How soon can you present this to the Council?" "Give me a week to verify all 5 original power nodes and map their current capacity. Then I can give the Council actual numbers instead of preliminary findings." Seravine nodded. "A week." She paused and then said something quieter than her public voice and more direct. "When you arrived, I told myself I had made a practical decision, that sending for someone unconventional after 16 conventional failures was simply logic." She met his eyes. "I did not let myself believe it might actually work. I had learned to be careful about that." Marcus thought about the 12 jobs before this one, about every station administrator and colony operator who'd called Earth after the proper channels had already given their answer, about how hope and caution always arrived together in that combination, and how you couldn't rush either one. "It's going to work," he said. Not because he was certain of everything ahead. The building still had opinions about the schedule. The Council still had 12 delegations covering their position, but the original builders had been right about their structure for 11 centuries, and the evidence for that had been sitting in a basement, sealed behind a panel everyone had mistaken for decoration. Seravine looked at him for a moment, then she nodded once, in the way that meant she had decided to let herself believe it. That was the most important repair he'd made so far, and he hadn't even touched a tool. The second Council session felt different before anyone opened their mouth. Marcus noticed it in how the representatives took their seats. The Tereshi delegate arrived early. Her 4 sets of arms in the configuration his briefing materials listed as prepared engagement, not polite attendance. The 8 conditionally supportive delegations were sitting forward. Even the 12 position-covering ones had a different quality to their stillness. People who'd heard things in corridors and wanted official confirmation before deciding what to do with it. He'd spent the week exactly as he'd said he would. All 5 original power nodes documented, verified, mapped. The Eastern Foundation column fully restored to its original flex tolerance, 3 days ahead of what he'd told the Council, which was either good luck or the result of Dessa working extended hours without complaint and not making a production of it either way. Korath had stood in the basement corridor, watching the first successful flex cycle run through the restored column, with the expression of a man whose grandfather had been right about something for 81 years and had not lived to see it confirmed. Marcus had documented that too, not officially, just for himself. He pulled up the holographic model and started with the power nodes, because the power nodes changed the shape of every other number in the room. He walked them through it the same way he'd walked Seravine through it. No performance, no presentation materials, just the plain sequence of what the evidence showed. The original 1st century power infrastructure, sealed deliberately by builders who understood that future modifications were a bigger threat than future deterioration. 1,100 years of continuous operation, 63% average remaining capacity across 5 nodes, which when mapped against the Citadel's actual power needs, meant the original system could run the entire structure at full function with room left over. The complete replacement cost from the Guild team's final report, the number that had nearly ended the conversation about the Citadel's future, was based entirely on a modified system, one that could now be decommissioned. The chamber went quiet. The Tereshi representative spoke first. She said it slowly, working out the implications as she went. The Guild team's cost assessment was the primary factor in the Council's near decision to pursue an alternative site. That assessment was based on incomplete information. Based on the information available from the records they accessed, yes. Marcus kept his voice even about it, because the Guild teams hadn't been negligent. They'd been working from the standard starting point, and there is a difference. The original infrastructure wasn't in any format that loaded automatically. It required the first-century schematics and a maintenance panel that hadn't been opened in 600 years. The Seravani representative leaned forward. You are saying the Citadel's abandonment was nearly decided on the basis of a problem that didn't exist. I'm saying the problem everyone was trying to solve wasn't the actual problem. Marcus pulled up the side-by-side comparison, Guild assessment against original infrastructure reality, and let the numbers make the argument. The actual problem was 300 years of repairs working against the building's own design. That problem is solvable. 14 months for full structural restoration, 6 additional months for secondary systems. He brought up the cost figure he'd spent 3 evenings calculating, lower than the alternative site negotiation estimates the Council received last year. The number sat in the chamber and got looked at from every angle. Then the Valdrani Border Council representative spoke from the upper tier, the one who had asked him the real question in the first session. Mr. Hale, you have now shown that the previous structural assessment was based on incomplete information, that the power infrastructure projection was based on a system that need not be replaced, and that the repair timeline is shorter and less expensive than the alternative. He paused, the same deliberate way he had the first time. What has the past week shown you about the Citadel that the numbers do not cover? Marcus thought about Korath's grandfather, about builders who sealed their best work behind panels and marked it with symbols they hoped someone would eventually read correctly. About a queen who had been careful about hope long enough that deciding to believe something might actually work was its own kind of courage. It was built by people who understood that the most important thing they were making wasn't the structure, he said. It was a place where the alternative to agreement had to travel farther than the agreement itself. They engineered that into the building. The flex system isn't just structural, it's why the place survived things that should have finished it. They built adaptability into the foundation because they knew everything around it was going to change, and they wanted the Citadel to change with it, instead of against it. He paused, then said the part he hadn't planned to say but which was true. Every repair that nearly killed this building was made by people who thought adaptability was a flaw. The building survived anyway. That tells you something about what the original builders actually understood about making something last. The chamber was quiet again, but different from before. Not 32 people deciding how to react, 32 people sitting with something that had reached past the technical content. The vote came 90 minutes later. Seravine sent Dessa to find him in the basement, where he'd gone back to the 4th sealed panel because the deliberation was going to take as long as it took, and the panel wasn't going to document itself. He arrived back in the chamber with dust on his jacket and his scanner in hand, which was probably not the intended image for a historically significant vote, but was accurate. And Seravine met him at the door rather than waiting at her position. 29 in favor, she said. 2 abstentions, 1 opposed. Marcus let out a slow breath. Your head advisor. She tilted her head. He submitted another formal objection to the record. He is thorough. What did this one say? That proceeding on the basis of an uncertified assessment represented an unacceptable institutional risk, and that the Council was setting a precedent, prioritizing outcomes over proper process. She paused. He is not entirely wrong about the precedent. No, Marcus agreed, but proper process had 300 years and 16 teams, and came within 1 vote of tearing this building down. He looked back at the chamber, at the crystal dome and the afternoon light coming through it. Sometimes the precedent that needs setting is that the outcome matters. Seravine was quiet for a moment, her iridescence doing that thing it did when she was thinking about something next to what she was saying. Then she said, "There is a formal designation in Valdrani diplomatic tradition for individuals who perform a service of significant historical consequence to the Citadel. It carries a title, ceremonial responsibilities, and the right to attend council sessions without requiring an invitation." Marcus looked at her. "What does the title translate to, roughly?" "Keeper of original intent." He thought about that for a moment. The builders who sealed the power nodes. Korath's grandfather writing down observations that 2 guild teams thanked him for and ignored. The flex points keeping a building alive for 11 centuries, while everyone tried to repair them into rigidity. "I'll take it," he said, "on one condition. Korath and Dessa receive a formal institutional acknowledgement that the maintenance records their families kept for 3 generations were primary source documentation, not anecdotal observation of questionable analytical rigor." Seravine's expression moved into something warm and precise at the same time. "Done." She extended her hand in the human gesture she had clearly learned at some point in the past 2 weeks, without mentioning it. "Formally, on the record." He shook it. It was ordinary and it meant everything it meant. The 14 months that followed were the most complicated of Marcus's professional life and the most satisfying. The eastern column held through the first major geological shift event 4 months in, the flex system doing exactly what it was designed to do, while Korath stood in the basement watching the readings with an expression Marcus had stopped trying to describe. The original power nodes came back online incrementally as the modified Century 9 infrastructure was decommissioned, each one restoring capacity the guild teams had projected would need full replacement. The atmospheric systems in sections 7 through 12 started working correctly about 48 hours after Marcus disconnected the 200-year-old misdirected power draw, which Dessa called the most embarrassing repair in Citadel history, and Marcus called completely typical of buildings that had been modified by people who skipped the original schematics. The head advisor submitted 7 more formal objections across those 14 months. Marcus read all of them. They were thorough and occasionally identified process gaps he hadn't considered. He sent acknowledgements that said so. By the 9th month, the objections had shifted from opposition to rigorous scrutiny, which is a different thing and a useful one. At month 11, the council held a working session in the restored Eastern Wing, the first functional use of that section in 60 years. The Tereshi representative told Marcus over the post-session meal that her delegation had withdrawn its preliminary interest in an alternative site. Not because of the vote, she said, with the directness her people considered a courtesy, because the building works. Evidence is more convincing than process. I find that's usually true, Marcus said. Seravine found him on the last evening of the 14th month in the schematics room, which had become his room the way spaces become yours after enough consecutive hours in them. The holographic model rotated slowly on the central table, original blueprints overlaid with current structural readings, and for the first time since he'd pulled up that comparison on his first evening here, the 2 images aligned. Not perfectly, nothing 11 centuries old is perfect, but genuinely, in the way that means a building is finally being what it was built to be. She stood beside the table and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Her iridescence was in the color he still didn't have a name for, the one that wasn't in his briefing materials. "It looks like the original," she said. "It's not the original." Marcus leaned against the table. "It's got 3 centuries of history in it that the original didn't have. The flex tolerances are compensated for the permanent changes the Century 6 work made. The power nodes are running a slightly different load distribution because the building's usage patterns have changed over 1100 years. He paused. It's what the original was trying to be, given everything that happened to it between then and now. Seravine looked at him with the expression he'd finally understood around month 7. It had stopped being assessment a long time ago. It was the look of someone who had decided something and was at peace with it. "You said once you had never stayed anywhere longer than a year," she said. Marcus looked at the holographic citadel, at the flex points moving correctly through their first full seasonal cycle, at the power readings holding steady across all 5 original nodes. "Yeah," he said. "The Keeper of Original Intent designation carries a minimum tenure of 3 years, she said, for continuity of institutional knowledge." She paused. That is the official reason. What's the unofficial reason? Seravine's iridescence settled into that unnamed color and stayed there. That the person who reminded this citadel what it was built to be is also the person I would most prefer to have present while it remembers. Marcus looked at her for a moment, then at the building around them, this stubborn 11th-century-old structure that had survived everything by being designed to move with the world instead of against it. Then back at Seravine. 3 years minimum, he said. At least, she said. They stood together in the schematics room, while the holographic citadel turned slowly between them. Original intent and present reality finally, after 300 years of misaligned repairs, telling the same story. Outside, through walls that were breathing correctly for the first time in 3 centuries, the 3 territorial borders held their uneasy peace in the shadow of a fortress that every qualified expert had agreed was finished. Turns out nobody had asked the building. I keep thinking about that mechanic every time I see something that everyone has given up on. The thing about Marcus isn't that he was smarter than 43 guild specialists. He wasn't. He just looked in the one direction nobody else had bothered to try, because it required an extra step to access, and they were already confident they knew what the problem was. That's not genius. That's just stubbornness and an unwillingness to accept the diagnosis before reading the original manual. Most things that look finished aren't finished. They're just waiting for someone who hasn't been told yet that it's hopeless. If this one stayed with you, drop a comment below. Tell me what you think the guild teams missed, or tell me about something you fixed that everyone said was past saving. I read every single one. And if you want more stories about humans who show up and do the quiet, stubborn work of fixing what the experts walked away from, you know the drill. HFY Soundscape has more waiting for you, and the next one is already ready to go.